Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobbin coming at you with another APGov video. This time we're taking a look at topic 5.1, voting rights and models of voting behavior. In this video, we're mostly going to be taking a look at the history of the expansion of voting rights in American history. A synonym that we use for voting rights is what we call suffrage. So if you ever hear of suffrage or earning the franchise, that's all talking about voting rights, the ability to be able to vote. And, you know, one of these very interesting threads throughout American history is this story of how, you know, from the Declaration of Independence, we talk about this idea that all men are created equal, that there's somehow, you know, a sense that, you know, something that justifies or rationalizes our existence as a nation is predicated on the idea that, you know, everybody is equal and therefore everybody should have a say in how our government works. Now, of course, when you look at the Constitution and how it's crafted, it's not exactly, you know, how the founders really put it into practice. But when we take a look at the study of the expansion of voting rights in the United States, it is bringing us ever closer to what the ideals are in the Declaration of Independence. Now, where do we start? Well, we start with, you know, white landowning males, and depending on where you live, a specific religious affiliation. So when we talk about when we actually become our own independent country, it's a very small percentage of the overall, even adult population, that is going to be legally able to vote. Now, keep in mind this. You know, the vast majority of voting rights are done at a state level. What we're talking about here are standards that are then going to be applied at a national level. So, you know, for example, these very early first standards are all going to be at the state level. All the states are going to be basically saying that you had to be over 21, you had to be white, owning property, male, and just depending on what state you lived in, if there was a specific religious requirement that you had to be affiliation to be a member of to be able to vote. Now, this is clearly going to be explained to some degree the types of political leaders that we're going to have in our first, you know, generation or so. It is a generation of leaders that are clearly of the wealthy elite class for sure on a state-by-state basis. And that makes sense because who's actually voting? Well, it's the elite, wealthy people of those respective states that are doing that. So it's people choosing people that are like them, that they can identify with, that they believe will share their values. But then we're going to start to see something change. You know, one of the enduring legacies of Thomas Jefferson is his belief, and of course this makes sense as the author of the Declaration of Independence, that the right to vote should be expanded, and that, you know, the average American white guy is somebody that should be able to have that voice. And we start to see, you know, once the Democratic Republicans take control of the federal government and, you know, a number of states, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic and the South, you're going to start to see this push for what is going to be called universal white male suffrage. And, you know, what this is going to do is change quite a bit of things, all right? You know, when we start to say that any white guy can vote, any adult over 21 that's a white guy can vote, you don't need that property requirement, there's no religious affiliation requirement, none of that kind of stuff. Well, think about this. This is then going to dramatically change the demographics of the type of voter that are out there. In other words, now the vast majority of voters are people of a working class background, a poorer background, a less educated background. And so candidates are going to have to change to be able to connect with those voters in a way they didn't have to before. You know, for example, somebody like a John Adams didn't have to worry about appealing to the common man because the common man didn't vote back then. But when we start to get into the, you know, the 1830s especially and beyond, if you are somebody like a Andrew Jackson or William Henry Harrison and, you know, even Abraham Lincoln and beyond, you have to be able to connect to the average American. Now, for some of these folks, you know, like Jackson and Lincoln, they did come from very humble backgrounds, so it made it very easy for them to connect. Others, like William Henry Harrison, will have to kind of craft an image that makes him connect to the average American voter, that famous, you know, log cabin hard cider campaign of 1840, even though Harrison grew up very, very wealthy. Something else that's going to be changing during the 1820s into the 1830s is how electors for the Electoral College, remember that's the institution that chooses the president, are going to be chosen. Prior to this time period, it would be state legislators themselves that would be basically casting the votes for who would be voting for the presidency of the United States. So in other words, you didn't really have any popular votes that really had anything that was binding or meaningful to it. States had those elections, but they were just kind of a way to have almost like a poll, if you will, as to what the people think. It was nothing binding at all. Now it's starting to become binding, and what would happen is that, you start to see, as it is today in almost every state, that the people will popularly vote for the candidate they want to see become president. And then based on those results, the state legislature will then select electors that promise to vote for the candidate that the majority of the voters in that state popularly voted for. So this is going to have a much more significant democratizing impact on the way that we choose the president. As we get into the post-Civil War era, we start to see some very important changes to the Constitution. Obviously, changes that will abolish slavery and provide citizenship for African Americans and be able to, apply due process and equal protection of the law at the state level. But then we also saw in 1870 the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Now, this is going to be done as a reaction to the end of the Civil War and concerns by radical Republicans in Congress that even though the war was over and slavery was abolished, that black Americans are not going to be able to have a fair shot in life if they don't actually have the same rights as white people, and that included the right to vote. And we do see, at least through, late 1860s into the 1870s, this really beautiful time where we did see black Americans in the South truly able to exercise the right to vote. We saw, a number of African Americans get elected to state legislatures. We even saw the majority of the South Carolina legislature be African American. We even saw a number of African Americans get elected to Congress, including Hiram Revels, the first U.S. Black senator representing the state of Mississippi. So there is this kind of wonderful thing that emerges, but unfortunately, if you know your history, when Reconstruction ends, all those real manifestations of the 15th Amendment start to go away, and there's a number of reasons for that. Once whites are going to be able to kind of do what they want, and knowing the federal government's not going to intervene and stop them, then we start to see these state legislatures begin to create all sorts of restrictions that, even though the 15th Amendment will exist and that any black man or any male of color could vote, in reality that's not going to be the case. We saw, for example, the emergence of what we call literacy tests that were designed to be very, very challenging government tests, citizenship tests that voters had to pass. And if you were black, your test was scored very, very strictly, and it was almost impossible to be able to pass, especially if you were black and you're going through the segregated public school system of the times. It was very, very hard to get a quality education. You also had poll taxes. Poll taxes are going to be, as the name implies, a fee that you would have to pay to be able to vote. Now, that might not seem like a huge deal, but if you are African American, particularly in the post-Reconstruction era, the vast majority of black Americans are struggling financially. So if it's a matter of paying to vote or paying to eat, well, you're going to pay to eat. So that's going to keep black Americans from exercising the right to vote. You also saw the use of grandfather clauses. Now, the 15th Amendment is pretty explicit in saying that the right to vote cannot be denied on account of race or conditions of previous servitude. So the authors of that amendment, thought about, how some folks might try to get around this amendment. So, they were afraid that, they might say, hey, if you were a slave, you couldn't vote. And so they prevented that. But as you can see here, in a pretty diabolical way, you're going to see Southern whites create rules that say, well, if you want to be able to vote, you have to be able to prove that your grandfather was eligible to be able to vote. Well, if you're living in the Gilded Age, in the late 1800s, and you're black, almost certainly your grandfather was a slave. And if your grandfather was a slave, well, wasn't able to be a legal voter, ergo, you were not a legal voter. And so this is going to be continuing on up until about World War I. So a pretty insidious way to keep black Americans from voting. You also had the use of white primaries. Now remember, the right to vote, and note, almost all of these Civil War era constitutional amendments that are going to be ratified are going to be very narrowly interpreted by the Supreme Court. Like, for example, Plessy versus Ferguson, when you apply it to equal protection of the law. And it also occurred with the 15th Amendment. So, for example, when you're talking about the right to vote cannot be denied, well, that's going to be interpreted by the courts as only in general elections. Okay, well, how about the primary elections, the elections that determine which candidates actually get on the ballot for the general election? Well, in many of these southern states, you had the Democratic Party, which was the dominant party at the time in the South, basically create rules that say only white people could vote in those primaries. Well, if only white people could vote, then you're going to end up with candidates on the general election ballot that are only going to be concerned about the needs of white Americans, and certainly are not going to be electing anybody that is black to be a candidate for office. So this is another way that we're going to be seeing black Americans disenfranchised in the process. And this lasts, up until World War II. And it's pretty, disgusting, but, some of these rules, like the poll taxes and the literacy tests, stay on up until the mid-1960s. The poll tax is going to be requiring a constitutional amendment to outlaw, and the literacy test is going to be outlawed only with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed. So understand that there are still millions of Americans that are alive today that can remember when literacy tests were still being applied in the South for folks that were wanting to vote. Pretty amazing. Now, we also see, as we get into the beginning of the 20th century, an expansion of the democratic process through the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is going to create a direct election for all U.S. senators. Now, originally, remember, U.S. senators were chosen by state legislators. Remember, the Senate was designed to be more of the elite chamber versus, the House, which was the people's chamber. And so different people should be having, the opportunity to vote for who represents in those chambers. Well, by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century, the Senate election process had gotten pretty seedy. It had become, a pretty clear way to allow corruption to play a role. Bottom line, you had folks that are going to be nominated to be U.S. senators by corrupt party bosses, and you would see the use of kickbacks and bribes and all sorts of, pretty corrupt stuff used in the process of electing these folks to become U.S. senators. So if you've got corrupt state legislators choosing who gets to be the senator, well, they're gonna elect a corrupt U.S. senator. And when we get into the progressive era, one of the things that the progressives really focused on was cleaning up government, making it less corrupt. And one of the mantras of the progressives when it came to cleaning up government was the idea that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. So in other words, if you want to clean up government, you want to get rid of the shady bosses and stuff like that, give more direct voting power to the people, and that's what the 17th Amendment does. So today, just like for House members, we directly elect U.S. senators. Now, by the end of World War I, we see another important change in who's now going to be eligible to vote. Starting with the 19th Amendment, anybody, at least on paper, was able to vote as long as you were 21 or older, with the 19th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote cannot be denied on account of sex. So that's going to be an important achievement. By the time we get to the 1960s, we see the expansion of democracy into the District of Columbia. Remember, the District of Columbia is not a state, so still to this day, it does not have any voting members in the House, does not have any voting members in the Senate, and up until 1961, did not have any members in the Electoral College. But that will change with the 23rd Amendment. The Electoral College is going to allow D.C. to have 3 Electoral College votes. And kind of wrap this up here. Well, you know what? I think I'm going to leave it here for right now. When I come back, we'll do another video. We'll take a look at the impact of the Voting Rights Act, the 26th Amendment, and then we're going to get into some models of how people vote. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.